Hello and welcome back to the From My Perspective podcast, where I, Jackson McCarty, tell you all the names you need to know in the college football landscape that could be changing the football landscape in the very near future. So today, week 3 has now wrapped up. We're going to take a look at my 5 biggest notes that I want to focus on from that. We're going to have a little bit more of an optimistic second half to this podcast. We're looking at those teams that started off on the wrong foot or have not looked as good as we potentially expected this point in the year, and then I'm going to reveal how I did in my predictions from last week. So before we jump into any of that, make sure you hit subscribe. Helps me out a ton. I'm just trying to grow the channel. So yeah, let's think about week 3. We just wrapped that up. There were plenty notable games, plenty of notable outcomes, especially in some places that you wouldn't have thought that there was going to be much to talk about post-game. So we're here to break that all down and kind of the 5 biggest things that I took away from this past week. Most notably, for me personally, that Arkansas-Missouri State game. Missouri State was beating Arkansas for 3 quarters and held Arkansas to 14 points up until the 4th quarter. Now, do I think that Arkansas is some kind of fraudulent team? Not really. I've been on record saying that I don't believe that they're a top 10 team as far as talent goes, but I do think that they're still a really strong unit whenever it comes down to it. My thing is that when you look at the coaching positions that are already coming open, Nebraska's open, Arizona State's open. With Nebraska, you've already heard some rumblings about Urban Meyer potentially getting an interview for that spot. So my question is, why isn't Bobby Petrino allowed to potentially be involved in these? Because I personally think that he could absolutely be a name that starts coming up in this next coaching carousel. You're not going to be able to argue that Bobby Petrino is a great citizen or outstanding human being. He's messed up a lot, and he's had very unceremonious exits from Arkansas, from Atlanta whenever he went to the NFL. His track record is not pretty. I understand that, but at the end of the day, Urban Meyer has left every program that he's ever been at in a worse condition than whenever he arrived. I don't think he could do that at Nebraska. I think they're kind of beyond saving at this moment in time. It'll take a year or two probably to get them lined out. But Bobby Petrino still very clearly has a lot left in the tank as far as being a head coach goes. I mean, he just went toe-to-toe with his old team, a team that was currently ranked right around that top 10 spot, and almost beat them. If we stopped that game at the end of the 3rd quarter, Missouri State walked out of there as champions. So I find it really interesting that one of these guys, who, by the way, the one who had the most recent issue was Urban Meyer in the NFL. He was kicking Josh Lambo and staying off the team flight to do things that I'm sure you've seen the video. I don't feel like I have to explain that situation to you, but he is coming off of a horrendous situation in Jacksonville, but he's still being considered. I'm just curious as to why Bobby Petrino is not on that list. Overall, that game was pretty ugly throughout the entirety, very sloppy football until Arkansas kind of figured it out in the 4th quarter and got things moving. There was another game that I was watching just about the entirety of, and they just never figured out how to make it a clean football game. Neither team really could put the pieces together. Miami and Texas A&M was one of the uglier football games I've seen in some time, and I really don't know how to feel about the final outcome of it. Quarterback play in this game was beyond bad. Tyler Van Dyke, who I keep saying it week in, week out, because I do think that he will make the jump again, but he was throwing just about 50% of completion rate right there and had like 40-something odd attempts. Max Johnson did not look good at A&M. It was just gross from that point. Their running backs looked pretty solid, but nobody could find the end zone. Ended at a really ugly score. It was 17-9. It was an old-fashioned football game, but not what you would assume 2 top 25 teams would put together. You would at least think that they'd be able to find the touchdowns through the air or find a little bit more consistency, but neither team could really, sew it all together. At the end of the day, I do think Miami's a better team, but betting on either one of those teams after that game feels very uncomfortable to me. A&M especially, because we're told that the SEC is just so much more dominant than the rest of college football is. And at the very top, you're absolutely right. Georgia, Alabama, those two are very hard to beat, and not a lot of teams can say that they can go toe to toe with them. You just so happen to have two of the best college football programs in one conference. But whenever A&M, who was supposed to be a really highly regarded team, can barely get it done against a Miami team who is realistically at least second in the ACC right now, it all just feels very weird to me. And I don't think either one of these teams expected it. I figure both will probably bounce back. Just don't have a lot of confidence leaving that game. Something I do feel confident about, rather somebody I feel confident about after the conclusion of his game, is Jaren Hall. Despite the fact that he lost to Oregon at BYU, he's BYU's quarterback if you don't know, despite the fact that they lost, I think Jaren Hall is a legitimate Heisman candidate, at least to this point in the season, because he keeps going out there and putting up good numbers against good competition. The strength of schedule is going to be there for BYU. The talent roster, it's not like he's not in the MAC, where it's, or whoever, where maybe you're getting a 7 or 8 win team just because they've played FCS schools and you're whatever. He's in the independents, so he's going up against guys that are put in front of him, but he's playing a ton of ranked teams. I think that if he continues his current trajectory, I think he could absolutely be a finalist at the bare minimum for the Heisman. He finished the game against Oregon with over 300 yards on 70% completion, and even in a loss was just super quality. He was the one thing about BYU in that game that truly looked capable of beating Oregon. The rest of the roster around him just did not appear to, follow suit in that regard. The quality of opponents, again, is there. I really like how BYU's schedule is set up. I think that if they can get over the hump within Arkansas or, whoever it may be, I think that they could really make some noise, maybe get to 9 wins, give or take. And at that point, if Jaren Hall is having an incredible season and the rest of their team looks so-so, I think there's an absolutely a discussion to be had for him to become the Heisman. And while quarterback numbers are great and you love to see a guy go out there from under center and make things happen, a lot of times it's not enough. For instance, Wake Forest, Sam Hartman's been back. He's been throwing the ball around the yard. He's been putting up a lot of numbers, but they're still just not a convincing, ranked team to me right now. You can't just barely beat Liberty by 1 and, still really come across as a really strong team, especially when it's all coming from quarterback. Again, they narrowly beat Liberty 37-36, and their other 2 games were VMI and Vandy. Vandy lost to them by about 20, which for most ranked schools on most years, and I've given Vandy credit, especially after their week 1 victory, or 0-week victory, I should say. It did not still really give me much confidence, and obviously VMI is not going to give me a whole lot to say about them at all. Clemson is coming up this week, so I think you can probably pencil in a loss there. They'll probably be removed from the rankings if that loss gets too ugly. But again, Hartman has a ton of passing yards. It's great that he's back on the field. I'm not trying to discredit that at all. I'm not trying to say that he's not a particularly good quarterback. I think he is a good quarterback. But whenever that's all you have, especially in the ACC right now where there is a lot of talent and a lot of good teams out there, it just doesn't really make me feel great that they're a ranked team. And again, I think they probably get knocked off this upcoming week. I just don't want to get too far ahead of myself because predictions will be on Thursday. The last big note I wanted to take from this was the fact that, and it actually kind of circles back to my predictions from last week, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but I said that Penn State was going to win in a fairly convincing fashion against Auburn. They did even more than that. Won by a lot, and I think Penn State's a real team that not a lot of people are going to be willing to admit are as good as they are. They stomped Auburn in one of the hardest places to play in the country. Their running game is good. Their defense is good. I'm not just the biggest Sean Clifford guy, but he's solid enough to not kill them and to not make them lose too many games or to really push them too far back. I think he can be fine. I don't really think that they're national championship contenders, but I do know that it makes the Big Ten feel pretty open. Obviously, Ohio State would be the favorite there, but with Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State all up in the East, it's going to get really, really fun at the top. And I cannot wait. Even Michigan State, despite losing to Washington last week, they're still a pretty good team. They're still capable of beating any one of those other three. With those four, that combination of those four in the East, I think it's going to get really, really fun. So those are my 5 thoughts for college football last week rather, and kind of how everything came together and just the things that I wanted to at least make note of. Now I want to look at the season as a whole and the teams that I believe could kind of recorrect on the back half here. I mentioned earlier, there's not just a ton of teams right now that I feel like they've had the season they expected to or the season they really hoped to. And there's certainly some that have performed well under what they expected or what they were trying to achieve. So there's 5 schools I want to focus on today that I think could be in for a huge bounce back, and I don't think that enough people are talking about. The first one I want to focus on is the Houston Cougars, who I think based on last year and what they were able to accomplish last year, I think that they're going to be able to make a recovery from where they're at right now. Houston's offense is beyond capable. They've hit 33 times out of 3 opportunities. The defense, I'm going to say, will come along soon enough. Clayton Tune works. Quarterback's fine. Running game will progress. Dana Holgorsen is their head coach. I feel okay saying, you know what, I'm going to put my faith in his hands. The issue right now is obviously the defense. They're letting up a ton of points, and that's not that's not sustainable. Doug Belk has not gotten his unit in order right now, but to lend you some credence, they finished at 19th in points allowed per game last year. I just think that it's a young team. It's a team that's trying to find its footing, and they caught the brunt of some tough scheduling. They really kind of got put through the ringer there for a little bit, but given a little bit more time, I'm going to go ahead and just trust the process, trust that Coach Holgorsen is going to figure it out, and I think that they do take a jump back up and kind of finished closer to the bottom of that top 25 like they were initially projected to be at the beginning of the year. The next team I want to talk about is not one that I've heard just tons of hope for. Obviously, they had a pretty big transfer come in. The roster looks good. West Virginia, the roster is not the problem whatsoever. Neil Brown needs to figure it out. He needs to figure it out now because his ability to understand what it takes to be a coach at West Virginia, it is the crucial point of this entire focal point for West Virginia. If he can't figure it out, obviously they won't be great. They won't make the comeback or anything. But if he can, they can be a really dangerous team. The running game's good. JT Daniels is fine. The team is just run into Pitt and a surging Kansas football team. Somebody want to tell me when Duke, Kansas, Syracuse, all these schools got good at football? I don't understand it whatsoever. It's so just strange, like it doesn't look normal at all. But as a whole, it's not really West Virginia's fault. Kansas is playing out of their mind. Pitt was ranked, and they were in contention. They lost to them by 7 there. I think that if Brown can make it click or at least find something in the interim to kind of hold things over and just kind of let the team do their thing, maybe he needs to delegate more to his coordinators and get that sorted out. But I think that they could be a really talented team despite the fact that they still have 4 more games against currently ranked opponents. I even kind of like them making some noise against Texas. I think that could be a possible outcome that we see on Saturday, and I would not be shocked if Texas falls to West Virginia when that time comes. So the roster is there. They just need to figure out the coaching issue. There's another team that I want to talk about here that I would argue the roster is not particularly solid, but the fact that their quarterback is as good as he is kind of lets them hang in just about any game. That is Purdue. We're talking about Aiden O'Connell, who is currently 4th in the nation in total passing yards, and he has an 8-to-1 touchdown ratio. We've seen it in all of the games they've played to this point. He is very capable of keeping Purdue and the Boilermakers in the running. They've just got to figure out some other pieces to help him a little bit. They kept up with Penn State. They lost that game by 4. They lost to Syracuse by 3. The Syracuse, again, I don't understand where these magical powers for the basketball school came from, but here we are. Overall, Aiden O'Connell has been a driving point in why those 2 games were close, and then they blew out Indiana State. So we really don't have to talk about that. as a whole, you're just missing that one little piece, and you're kind of letting your quarterback take the reins and do anything and everything he wants to, but it's keeping you in a lot of games that without him you wouldn't have been anywhere near. So once they start to put it together, I think Purdue has a legit shot at making some noise, getting competitive, really staying in a lot of games, but coming out on the other side. They could also be in Nebraska, where they stay in every single game but can't quite get over the hump like Nebraska did last year. I could see that line, I could see on either side of that line of them falling, but I'm going to go ahead and guess that they'll end up being a little bit more winning than that Nebraska team was. So we've kind of stuck to the larger conferences, or at least teams that are soon to be larger conferences, with Houston making the jump over to the Big 12 soon. We're going to step down, or we're going to step to the group of five now, at least full time. Arkansas State, they're currently 1-2, but fun fact, they have 10 more points for than they do points allowed so far this season, despite being 1-2. Plus, those two losses that they have currently, pretty tough teams to beat. You've got Ohio State, obviously. It's Ohio State. They lost that game 45-12, which not as ugly as it could have been. So I guess minor, some kind of moral victory, something or another there. And then they had Memphis, who they barely lost to. So as a whole, Arkansas State staying in the game with Memphis looks really, really good. Beat up on another team to get that one win. And then Ohio State, like I said, not the worst that it could have been. It could have been much worse, but they look like one of the better Sun Belt teams in football right now, and that's despite having some really good teams in the Sun Belt currently. You got App State and Coastal and other teams that are capable of making noise. Now, are they on the same plane as App State and Coastal? No. Are they able to compete or maybe even win the Sun Belt West? I think they are. I really do think they're capable of that, because while I don't love Butch Jones, he is probably the most qualified coach. I don't love that either, but he's a very well-known coach, and he's now down at Arkansas State getting some image rehabilitation. Arkansas State has been really, really good at that, by the way, like the whole helping a head coach revitalize himself and get back on track. You had Malzahn, Harsin was there for a little bit, Blake Anderson got the Utah State job and went out there and did insane his first year, and now it's Butch Jones' turn. So they've got leadership that has been some very, very lucrative places. They've got a roster that's pretty solid, especially for the Sun Belt. I like the idea of them turning it around and potentially really becoming a problem within the Sun Belt West. So the last team I want to look at, probably the most obvious one in the country, because they weren't expected to start 0-2. They got one win back against Cal, but Notre Dame does not look like Notre Dame typically does, but it's still a Notre Dame roster, so you can never fully count them out. The quarterback situation is sketchy, but you still got NFL caliber guys around him. You still got who I believe is a good coach. Tommy Rees should probably lay off yelling at his quarterback mid-game. All that's going to do is freak him out, or make him not confident whenever you have to send him back out under center. But the pieces are there. Buckner would probably help, but the pieces are there. The big thing is the remainder of the schedule. You've got UNC, Stanford, UNLV, Navy, and Boston College, who I consider all beatable. I think Syracuse will probably come down off their hot wave by the time Notre Dame plays them. So, yeah, they don't scare me all that much, especially with it being down the road. I don't think that they're a super sustainable team, so I think Notre Dame by that point will be picking up steam, while Syracuse is probably losing it. And then the other two games still remaining on their schedule are Clemson and USC. So that's 4 losses. If Notre Dame can go from 0-2 to 8-4, I think you've had a really successful season on your hands. And I do believe that that's a genuine possibility for the rest of the season. Like I said, there were a couple schools on there. Boston College could be fun. UNC has looked decent enough. Drake May looks like a good quarterback, but beyond that, I don't just, love the makeup of the rest of their schedule. I do love it for Notre Dame, though. So that was episode 34 of the From My Perspective podcast, and as always, I'll see you next time.